Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this afternoon's webinar, which is being hosted by the education team in Mason, Hayes and Curran in conjunction with ESCI. My name is Ian O'Hurley and I'm head of the education team. And can I say at the outset that it's a real pleasure for the education team to partner with ESCI. This is the first time we've done it, but we really hope that it's not going to be the last time. There's been a huge response and a huge interest in today's webinar. Believe it or not, there are 957 people have registered for the webinar today, which is an absolutely enormous number. So I think you'll all not be surprised to hear that we've turned off the chat function, because I think that would be pretty impossible to manage with those kind of numbers. I'd like to introduce my colleagues, firstly from my own team, Catherine Kelly, Fiona, Sheil and David Ruddy, who will be known to many of you already. And also from ESCI, I'd like to welcome David McCaig, who's chairman of ESCI, and Stephanie Keating, who is the director of Athlone Education Centre and who'll also be talking to us later. David, would you like to say just a few words on your part?
Ian, Ballamara, doesn't buy a privilege dom of a lower live in you, Harkan Eski, under the Dockish, August the Holy Dockish are fad, or Fodl Chira. Many of you aware that Eski are a representative body for the 21 education centres, 21 full-time centres, and the 8 part-time centres across Ireland. I suppose we have a role in supporting school communities and education communities, and that support can take many different forms that extend into many different areas, given the multiplicity and the complexity and the layered nature of school life. But today is our first foray into the realm of the legalities of the education profession and the responsibilities and obligations of teachers in that space. And we're absolutely delighted to do that in collaboration with Mason, Hayes and Curran. I think over the past maybe 9 months or even beyond that, we've developed many strategic partnerships with stakeholders in many different facets of education system. And all of our partnerships and collaborations, the focus is always on the value, the added value that partnership can bring to our learning communities. I'm delighted to say that today this webinar is our starting point in our strategic partnership with Mason, Hayes and Curran, I think who are synonymous with the provision of quality advice and reliable advice for schools and teachers, and have a long history in that space. I know at ESCI level in our own discussions around this collaboration, we were very quick to decide that this was of value to our teachers, and that's been particularly significant in the rollout of today's session. We're very conscious that our attendees with us today do so of their own volition and their own voluntary capacity, and in their own time also. And I think teachers join sessions like today because the title or the topics in which have been highlighted have resonated with them in some way. So we look forward to, I suppose, a session that is relevant and is supportive, and I suppose that's based in the context of each individual teacher who has joined us today. So those are the guiding principles of today's session, and I hope that through our journey through the relevant topics and the topics we've identified, that teachers can take value into their own practice and their own experience, maybe even in avoiding some of the issues that will manifest themselves throughout today's webinar. So look, and I hope the engagement will be of support to our teachers in their individual setting, but also that will stimulate some thoughts on maybe the type of support that teachers can reach out to education centres for further support. And I say we're always very open to those requests and look forward to maybe a further flow of these webinars in conjunction with Mason, Hayes and Curran in the future. So, Gurmil Madal Ian, Tamig Sul Gamor this session of the Scanary Lid Gap.
Thank you, David, for that. That's those kind words. So, just on this slide you just put up on now, I mean, why our teachers need to know their law. You don't need to be lawyers. Your expertise is in teaching. But our aim today maybe is to try to demystify some of the kind of legal principles that would come across our desk in terms of acting for schools, acting for school managements, acting for teachers, and just to assist you in kind of knowing where the law comes from and how it interacts with schools. So to kind of some of the issues that we're going to be looking at are, firstly, your duties as an employee. The second thing would be, say, your duty of care to students. That's something that comes up quite a lot, particularly around accidents in schools and supervision issues. I'm going to be talking about, the basic nuts and bolts around child protection, mandatory reporting, mandated persons. And Stephanie is going to be talking about the Teaching Council Code of Conduct as we go through this as well. So we hope that's going to be something of interest for everybody. David.
Thank you, Ian, and good afternoon to everybody, to all our fellow teachers. We're going to start off with a few questions for you, and these questions will be answered as we go through our session, but just to get a snapshot. So the first one is about your role as a mandated person in relation to child protection. Are you clear about that role? So you might answer that question now if we'd like to get your opinion on it. And when you do so, we'll move on to a few further questions that will be topics dealt with as we go through our session there. So your role as a mandated person. And Sive, thank you, Sive Little is behind the scenes there conducting these polls. So our second poll is in relation to another substantive area, your legal duty of care to students. Do you understand the concept of legal duty of care? So again, we'd like to find out what your answer to that is. And we will publish the results towards the end of our session. And it'll be quite interesting. That's question number 2. We're now going to move on to question number 3, and this is in relation to the school's health and safety statement. And it's a fairly straightforward question, maybe easier than the others in a sense, because it's just, have you read your school's health and safety statement over the last year? And there's been a huge emphasis on health and safety, particularly with the advent of COVID-19. So it's a very important document, and we're just curious as to whether you've had an opportunity to read it. And even if you haven't, hopefully you will get a chance shortly to do so. And our last question is, I suppose, to provoke a little bit of thought for you. Again, we'll deal with it. Would you feel confident, or do you feel confident about dealing with a fight in the schoolyard? So I don't know whether you have had to deal with this already, but I guess at some stage, unless you're a very, very unusual school, there will be a fight in the yard and you'll have to deal with it. So we're just wondering how confident you feel about that. And we will debate this and have a number of questions and answers for you in relation to that too. So thank you very much for participating in the poll, and we look forward to sharing the results at the end of our session. So we're now going to move on to the next area, and this is the whole question of negligence. And I'm going to call on our colleague, Catherine Kelly. Good afternoon, Catherine, how are you?
Good afternoon.
And Catherine is going to talk about this relationship between duty of care and negligence. So over to you, Catherine.
Thank you, David. In relation to negligence, there seems to be an idea that if you receive an injury, that you're automatically entitled to compensation for that injury. But legally, that's not the case. There is the legal concept of negligence, which provides that you must have a duty of care to that person. There must be a breach of that duty, and then there must be some kind of a damage, like an injury, as a result of a breach of that duty. Now, it stands to reason that as teachers and principals in schools, you have a duty of care towards the students in the school. So we normally go on to the next stage of it then, which is the breach of that duty, because you are in loco parentis and you are in charge of the children. So if anything happens to you to them on your watch, there may be a finding of negligence against the school in that regard. Say, for example, in relation to the schoolyard, we have cases where somebody gets injured. They will look at what was the supervision in place at the time in the schoolyard, the health and safety policy, all of that will come into play. And in my experience, there is definitely a higher standard in relation to what schools are required to do, as opposed to, say, the parent at home. I know my own child fell at home and broke her arm, and I wasn't asked for a health and safety statement or, discovery of documentation in relation to yard supervision. So it is a very, very high bar in our experience.
So, Catherine, just to follow up on that, as you say, accidents do happen at home, and you've given an example yourself. And in school, we have 1 million students in our schools at primary and post-primary level. So what happens if I don't turn up for yard duty, or if I make a genuine mistake in my role as a teacher? Will I lose the roof over my head, as my mother used to say, in relation to insurance and that?
Well, we like to assure people in relation to that, because the school will have an insurance policy, and there is a doctrine of vicarious liability. So anything that you do in the course of your employment should be covered under the school's insurance policy. There may be issues in relation to the fact that you didn't turn up for yard duty, or you weren't where you were supposed to be, like leaving, for example, and we'll talk about it later, leaving a class on their own. But that would be something that might be dealt with under the disciplinary procedures, which we'll be talking about later also. So you will be covered if it's some kind of injury that happens during the course of your employment in the school.
So, Catherine, thanks for that, because you've simplified what other people have taken a textbook to deal with. So I think you've got the bones of it across, and well done there. You mentioned the classroom, and of course, this is where most activity, the classroom and the yard, and we're going to look at that. So I'm going to call in our colleague, Fiona Sheil. Fiona, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon, David, and hi everybody.
Fiona, you're going to deal with the first 3 questions there, because these come across your desk a lot, don't they? And so what's your advice?
Yeah, correct. So some of these questions, that they're kind of difficult to give a straight out yes or no answer to, but just in relation to the first question and leaving a class unsupervised. So as Catherine has just said, the teacher is in the place of the parent, and with that borne in mind, if a teacher leaves his or her class unsupervised and there's an accident, the school may be in hot water. Classes are meant to be supervised. We are aware that this isn't always possible, but just to flag that you may be in difficulty if there is an accident and the class has been left unsupervised. Just in relation to the second question, can I put a student outside the school door? So similarly, putting a student outside the school door, it's not the best idea, aside from it being kind of humiliating for the student. Again, if an injury occurs when the child is put outside the class and supervised, we're in trouble. If there's any form of claim, it may be really difficult to defend. And just lastly there for myself, can I send a student on a message? We're aware that this goes on. Just a couple of practical tips, I guess, to bear in mind is the age of the child you're sending on a message. And you know, it may be a good idea to send the children out in pairs rather than sending a child alone. So that they'd be my tips there.
So you'd say for the first 2 questions, by and large, no, but for the third one, maybe, but with the caveat that you gave there.
Correct, David, yeah.
Thanks, Fiona, and I'll be back to you shortly. I'm going to come back to Catherine there with the next 2 questions. And the first one is the bowl corner. So I won't ask you, Catherine, you have to go into the bowl corner. You can tell us if you want, but over to you.
I'm going to plead the fifth on that one. No, it was the Cunha Donna in my day, and I was never in it. I can tell you that. Firstly, in relation to what Fiona was saying on the can I put the student outside the school door, we had a case recently where he decided he was wreaking havoc in the school, in the classroom, so the teacher put him outside, and he decided himself, you know, well, I'm just going to head home. So he left the school and wasn't caught leaving the school or anything like that, and arrived home. So that's a case where, you know, thankfully nothing happened to him, but he should have been more supervised than that. In relation to putting a child standing in the corner, absolutely not. Again, as Fiona said, that's just humiliating. We have had cases in relation to that, and you wouldn't ever do that. That's going to be very demeaning for that student involved. And if they run out of the classroom, we've had this on numerous occasions where students are flight risks. We had a particular student who ended up on a dual carriageway and had to be brought back by the guards. The school involved had a great plan in place because he'd done it before. So they were not at fault at all. They just couldn't keep him within the school. He had assaulted various staff members on the way out. and he was expelled from the school, but the expulsion was upheld in front of a Section 29 appeal. So that's something that you need a plan in relation to, definitely, in order to be able to defend it.
Yeah, Catherine, thanks for sharing that information, and particularly about that case that you were involved in. Ian, I'm going to spare your blushes and not ask you about the Cúna Dána, but tell us about mobile phones and school bags.
Yeah, but thinking about the question about mobile phones reminds me of a principal who rang me last year, was telling me that she had confiscated out the north side Dublin school, and the student said to her, Jesus, you can't take me mobile phone. Me bleeding life isn't that. So, you know, when you get teenagers, you sometimes think their mobile phones are like an extension of their body because they're so wedded to them. But it is perfectly permissible to have a policy that students will not use their mobile phones in any way in school, you know, either for phoning, texting, taking a picture, anything like that. And it's also perfectly in order for the school to have a policy that a mobile phone, if used, or a student who uses a mobile, will have their phone confiscated. An issue can sometimes turn up about policies. We've seen a few of them which have, you know, the school retaining the mobile phone, the confiscated mobile phone, for a significant period of time, like a matter of a couple of days. And we have had situations of parents saying, look, they're not happy about that because they want their child to have their mobile phone on the way home from school in case something happens or whatever, you know. But certainly the concept of confiscating a mobile phone, a student's mobile phone, for misuse is perfectly in order. The second issue is, you know, can I search a school bag? And the answer to that is really yes, with a but you're usually expected to have some sort of a reason for looking to search a school bag. For example, you know, is there something stolen in the school bag, or drugs, or even we've had a couple of cases, Fiona and I, of a knife in a school bag. And obviously, if a school is asking, they don't know what's in the school bag, so they're looking to find out. But the issue arises that if a student says no, you can't get into a tugging game where you're pulling the bag away from them, you know. And a lot of schools have got over that by it being kind of a disciplinary matter if a student is asked to open their school bag and they refuse. A bit like the drunk driving thing where, you know, if you refuse to give a breath sample, it's an offence in itself, a bit along those lines. So that's the kind of guidance we often give to schools in those issues.
But the takeaway from you there really is that you ought to have a policy on this.
Yeah.
Okay.
All sanctions in schools should be referred to in some way or other in a policy, a school policy, conduct. Yeah.
Thanks for that. We're now going to move from the classroom to the yard, as it were. And we've just posted a newspaper headline there, which unfortunately happens too frequently in schools where there are injuries, which are inevitable, but sometimes awards are given, and often we would dispute them. So the first question there is, what should be the ratio of teachers to students on the yard? So this is a matter really, and we're going back to what Ian alluded to, is the whole question of a policy. And the principal, in consultation with the board, should have a policy in place which will identify how many teachers are on yard duty. And that policy would be cognizant of things like the ages of the children, the physical layout of the yard, and indeed, if particular students have special education needs and who may have SNA support. In relation to the courts, when they have to adjudicate on these issues, they're inclined to look at cases literally on a case-by-case basis, because no school is the same, or no circumstances are. And they'll tell you very quickly if they feel that the supervision ratio of a teacher to the number of students is inadequate. They will never say what the exact ratio is, and nobody can. And I would say to you in relation to the layout of your yard and issues like that, that the insurance companies, and I know that Allianz in particular, are very good at advising schools and giving them guidance in relation to health and safety and that. So they're people you can talk to. Two further questions there, and Ian, I'm going to call you back in this in relation to these two scenarios. Again, you have a lot of experience, unfortunately, of dealing with defending schools in relation to these issues.
Well, just to deal with the second last one there, so a teacher is rostered for yard duty and is late, and then somebody gets injured, you know, whether as a result of a fight or whatever. I mean, just picking up on some of the sort of basic principles that Fiona and Catherine have spoken about, a school is going to find it very hard to defend that situation, because, you know, if the teacher is not in the yard, presumably there is less than full supervision. And, you know, as Catherine said earlier, the bar is put very high on schools. So you're going to find it really difficult to defend a case in that sort of scenario. The second one, the last one there is one, I think you put it in, David, because we had a case about a year and a half ago on that. And this case involved a secondary school. I think it was either 5th or 6th year, two big 6-foot odd lads dug into each other, you know, losing their temper, and a female teacher goes in to try to intervene in good faith and ends up, not, I don't think out of any malice, ends up getting a clatter because the two of them were just, you know, lost the plot. So, I mean, should I physically intervene? It depends. Now, I mean, like a lot of these situations, both ends of the spectrum are clear enough. So, you know, two kids in senior infants or first class, you know, there's not much problem, hopefully, in intervening and trying to separate the kids and get them to calm down. You know, a slim female teacher with two 5th and 6th year lads, you know, beating the head off each other, that's not necessarily intervention time. Maybe you might send a kid off to get help, but, you know, you have to, there's a judgment call, but there is a certain sense where you've got to take care of yourself and not stick yourself in the middle of two big lads having a fight, you know. So it's a judgment call.
And Ian, there's another thing really, shouldn't we, as a staff, rehearse situations or anticipate situations? Like fights will happen on yard, and for teachers to be thinking on the hoof, as it were, it's not very helpful. And I know you're a strong advocate of that, where they should sit down and discuss what will we do.
Yeah, well, when you say I'm a strong advocate, I am, David, but that's only because I've heard from a lot of principals and a lot of staffs that they've really got a tremendous amount out of rehearsal of foreseeable, I don't want to use the word crises, but foreseeable tricky situations in schools. You know, things like drugs in the school bag is another one, but here we're talking about a fight. Rehearsal in the staff room, particularly where you have some very experienced staff and maybe some new staff, could be a year or two qualified, they can learn a huge amount from the experienced staff as to how to deal with a situation, so that when the teachers actually come to deal with and confront a situation, they're able to say in the back of their mind, I remember we rehearsed this, you know, so this is not, I'm not out of my depth here. So absolutely, David, rehearsal, discussion in the staff room, principal, deputy principal, senior staff, junior staff.
And what that'll do for the confidence of the teachers and staff will be amazing. We're now going to move on to the whole question of child safeguarding and that. And Ian, you have two documents up here, and the one on the left, the blue one, is one that most teachers or all teachers would be familiar with. So would you like to take us through basically why they should be familiar with this booklet?
Yeah, well, I mean, just to say, I mean, every teacher, every school will be familiar with the original document, Children First. It's got a lot of publicity. but the set of 2017 guidelines that have been issued by the department, which we have up there, is I'm often given out about guidance the department gives or sometimes doesn't give, but this is a mighty set of guidelines. It's really, really helpful, and I've heard that from principals as well. So I mean, basically, the department with outside assistance took children first and took the children first legislation and put them into a set of guidelines, and they're really, really good. And I would just commend the guidelines, not only just for school management, but also to share perhaps bits over a period of time to share with your staff room, because there's a lot in there for ordinary sort of non-management teachers, if I could, classroom teachers there as well.
Okay, and the next thing we're going to talk about is the role of the mandated person in the school, the teacher.
Well, just put up the previous slide for a second, David.
Yeah, that's okay.
Oh no, maybe sorry. It's maybe the next.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah.
No.
Sorry, my apologies.
Yeah.
So the mandated persons. Well, you know, you're all teachers are now mandated persons, and when we say mandated persons, we're talking about persons in schools who are required to operate the mandatory reporting system. It's a statutory position. Mandated persons are statutory positions. All teachers who are registered are mandated persons, and they have two fundamental responsibilities there: to report, and we'll look at powers and analyze this in a moment, to report any reasonable concern of harm above a certain threshold to a child in report to TUSLA, and also generally to assist TUSLA. So that's the basic obligations, David.
So they have a statutory responsibility now that they may not have had in the past.
Absolutely, it was
mandated, and that
wasn't mandatory reporting until recently. And sorry, that's the slide I was asking you to put up.
Right, the reasonable concerns. Yes,
but there are reasonable grounds of concern and these are the four types of abuse, and you'll all be familiar with it. But the only thing that's worth saying about here is that the least common form of abuse, this is well recognized, is the last one, but it gets the most publicity. And the most common form of abuse, 90-something%, is the first one, neglect, and it gets the least publicity. But you know, they are the four headings, if you like, of abuse, four types of abuse.
Thanks for that. We're going to move on to a very important definition, the definition of harm. And this is something teachers have to get their heads around.
That's right. And, you know, there are two concepts when teachers, or indeed who are mandated persons, or indeed DLPs have to grapple with. One is harm and one is the threshold. So harm is either one of two things. If I go to the bottom one first, sexual abuse is automatically harm. There's no threshold, there's nothing. If there's a concern about a child who is possibly the subject of sexual abuse, automatically that comes within the definition. We then get into the kind of physical and neglect area, assault, ill treatment or neglect of a child in a manner that seriously affects or is likely to seriously affect a child's health, development, and welfare. And there's a judgment call around that. You know, there's a judgment call around whether that comes within the definition or not in an individual case.
But the good thing is, and we'll see in the next slide, in relation to the question of the reporting, isn't that right? And what TUSLA, the advisory role TUSLA have.
Yeah, well, you know, the first thing to say is that where a teacher has a concern, the teacher reports to the school's DLP, which is usually the principal, not always, but it's usually the principal. So, like, that's just a very simple reporting line. The DLP and the teacher then consider the matter and decide whether the reasonable grounds we've spoken about exist in an individual case. And then both consider the issue of the threshold of harm. So, you know, as a teacher, I would say, do not agonize if you have a concern. Report up the line. It's not your job to, on your own, to grapple with, you know, whether something should be reported or not.
So that'll come as a reassurance, certainly, to our teachers who are listening. And the next piece there, then.
Yeah, and the one thing I just want to say there is the first thing. I mean, obviously, mandated persons can't report a concern anonymously, but in the brackets is a very important thing. There is provision for an informal report by a DLP to TUSLA, where, and we use this all the time, I would think hardly a week goes by that we're not talking to some school around the country along these lines, where the DLP rings up the TUSLA and outlines a case, without going into names of children or anything like that, outlines a case, and TUSLA will advise whether they believe that it is something that should be reported or not, whether it amounts to harm or whether it's met the threshold or whatever it is. And if they TUSLA say it doesn't meet the threshold or isn't something that should be reported, then the DLP is entitled to write that down on their file, say they rang TUSLA, or the alternative is TUSLA say do report it, which can be very important, because if you report, for example, parents or guardians to TUSLA, or report concerns, you know, it's not unusual that both parents or guardians will come back and kind of attack the school verbally. And it's really important for the principal DLP to be able to say, I rang TUSLA, I outlined the situation, they told me report. I'm under a legal obligation to report, end of. You know. So
the important thing is not sanctions to do nothing.
There's no criminal sanctions for not reporting, but there are administrative sanctions potentially. But you really don't want to be getting into not reporting. That's no man's land for a teacher or for a DLP. You know.
So that's very much your takeaway. You have to report if warranted. The next piece we're going to do here is in relation to the role of the Department of Education and the inspectorate in particular. Now, the department inspectors didn't volunteer for this. TUSLA and the Ombudsman for Children insisted on this from the government. So there are 3 levels of inspections for schools, and these are important from your point of view as teachers. And I'm only going into detail really on level 1. And this can be for what's known as the II, the incidental inspection, or what's known as the drive-by or unannounced inspection. And what can happen there is the inspector will look to see, is there a child safeguarding statement and risk assessment? Is it on the wall of the school, basically near the entrance? Has the board, and the name of the DLP, has the Board of Management signed off on the policy? And secondly, it's subject to annual review, which comes up around this time of the year, I believe. So you have to do an annual review, and if you don't, they will take issue with that. And finally, I suppose from your point of view, is that all teachers who are visited by the inspector, they'll want to know, are you familiar with your child safeguarding policy and aware of your responsibilities, which informed our first question earlier on in the poll. The other 2 levels are more detailed, as you can see, for a whole school evaluation. There are 8 compulsory checks building on the first 3. And then the final one, the Child Protection Schools inspection, is a very thorough one, dedicated totally to child protection over 2 days with 65 subchecks, and a report is published in relation to that. Okay, we're going to move on from the area of child protection, and we're going to move on to your role as a teacher and as an employee of the school. So Fiona is going to talk about this, and particularly she's going to talk about this body, the Board of Management. Now, you may not be familiar with the board. The chairperson may have interviewed you for your job, or you may see him or her in and out of the school, but lots of the other members you might not be familiar with. So Fiona, how important a body is a Board of Management?
Very important, David. The Board of Management, they're responsible for managing the school. And all boards, they have to follow the government's manual set by the Department of Education. So You see from the slide there that the Education Act provides the board may appoint, suspend and dismiss teachers. So they have a lot of power, and they are the employer. And in respect of a board's power to dismiss staff, there's clear procedures to follow. Circular 49/2018, which I'm sure you're familiar with to some degree. And the procedures clearly lay out how to deal with competency and conduct issues. So it's well worth being familiar with the procedures. And I know Ian and Catherine are going to touch on that a bit further. But yeah, the board are responsible for managing the school. So yeah.
Fiona, is it fair to say the board hires and fires?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, I know it sounds blunt on that. And next you're going to move on to the question or the role of the principal. And this is, it carries a lot of responsibility, but you're going to take us through what's involved.
Yeah, thanks, David. So the role of the principal, it's defined in legislation. Sections 22 and 23 of the Education Act set out the functions of the principal teacher. So they're essentially responsible for the day-to-day running of the school, and they have authority to give directions to their staff. So principal has the authority to allocate classes and timetables to its staff. You'll see from the slide there, and an issue we see that comes up quite a lot at the start of school years in particular is a scenario where a teacher requests a certain class and the principal allocates the teacher another class, which results in an unhappy teacher. And just to note here that the principal is well within his or her rights to allocate different classes to different teachers, and teachers should move around. They should take different classes. But it's important to note that there should be some form of consultation with the teacher around this. So I know Catherine had advised on this recently in a High Court challenge. So I don't know if you want to come in there, Catherine.
Yeah, I've had a High Court challenge in relation to it, and I've had a constructive dismissal claim. In relation to the High Court challenge, it was a teacher that didn't want to move out of resource back into mainstream teaching, and the principal had put her back into mainstream teaching, and she took a High Court challenge stating that she was entitled to stay in the resource post. And the advice we got from our council and the advice we had given was that the principal is the one who allocates the classes, and he or she is entitled to do so. And in the end, that teacher involved had to withdraw her High Court claim. In relation to the constructive dismissal claim, the teacher involved wanted to teach a certain class, and the principal wasn't going to give her that class. She was changing the classes around for the upcoming school year, and the teacher involved was not very happy. So she was given the grievance procedure, which would be the normal way that you would deal with complaint about your employment. She didn't use the grievance procedure and instead resigned from her position and sought to take a constructive dismissal claim. And obviously that constructive dismissal claim would be fully defended on the basis that the principal is entitled to allocate the classes as he or she sees fit.
So Catherine and Fiona, that clearly demonstrates that the principal has the statutory responsibility to allocate classes and indeed organise timetables, and that you really cannot challenge that. Of course, you can put in a request and seek consultation, but that's the height of it. So thanks for that clarity, which I think will be appreciated. And we're now going to move on to the thorny area of underperformance and misconduct. And again, this is a big ask of Ian and Catherine to do it in literally a couple of minutes. There's a lot involved, but people have written books on this, but do your best. So over to Ian. I think you're going to start with the competency issue.
I'll start, David. And as you said, we could have a whole webinar on these procedures. I suppose the first thing to say is that there are two separate but sister procedures, if I could call them. They're in the one document. The first part deals with competency issues. The other part deals with conduct. And the competency procedure is a bit like, if you like, what we would call the PIP procedure in the normal employment world, PIP, performance improvement plan. So it's really a PIP procedure, if you like, translated into a school environment. There's an informal arrangement, an informal procedure. If that doesn't work, if that may involve PDST, but if it doesn't work, it goes on to a formal procedure. it's very important to point out that all of these procedures in relation to a teacher, both competency and conduct, and Catherine's going to talk about conduct in a moment, are initiated by the principal. And that's something I want to come back to in a second. If the formal procedure is not successful, it goes on to an external review fairly immediately to the inspectorate in the department. And that involves an inspector being assigned to the teacher in the school with scheduled and unscheduled inspections, drive-by, as you might call them, David. There's ultimately, if a report issues to the Board of Management and says in crude terms that whether the teacher is or is not competent, and that can move on to a hearing, and we've been through that, and ultimately there's an appeal, and appeal, Catherine will talk about the appeal in a moment. I suppose it's worth saying one thing before I hand over to Catherine, and that is these competency procedures are really, if you like, noteworthy for the fact that they're not used really at all. There are 70,000 primary and secondary teachers in the country, and about 15, if that, have been brought fully through the competency procedures, which is a really staggering, if you like, indictment of the procedures. And our only explanation, because we don't have an explanation, is that principal teachers really don't have confidence in them for whatever reason, and that's probably for another day's debate. I'll hand over to Catherine, who might say some words in relation to the conduct, the disciplinary conduct procedures. Catherine.
Well, the first thing I'll say is they're much more straightforward than the competency procedures. And sometimes what happens is you have a mixture of competency and conduct. So we would normally have to go through the issues that there are and decide whether or not it's a conduct or a competency issue. We do have a training video that we have done in relation to conduct meetings. So that might be, it's on our website, that might be of help to people if they want to see how these meetings run. So you start off with verbal warning, written warning. Those are in relation to issues like maybe shouting in class, failure to follow a reasonable instruction. You would go along the procedures as through the stages, okay? But sometimes there's a very, very serious issue that you might want to go straight in at stage 3 or stage 4 on, and that's allowed in the procedures. It allows you to skip the steps depending on the gravity of the conduct. There's also an appeal at most of the stages. Sometimes it's from the principal, say, to the chairperson of the board. Sometimes it's from the chairperson to the board, the full Board of Management. The last stage is an appeal. If you get a stage 4, a stage 4 would be in relation to dismissal or demotion or something of that nature. The appeal would be to the department. So a 3-person appeal panel would hear your appeal before for that stage 4 sanction.
Thanks for that, Catherine and Ian, and for giving such a comprehensive summary in a very short length of time. But it does give you an overview of the 2 different procedures and what's involved in relation to underperformance and misconduct. We're now going to move on to a final piece here, and I'm going to call on Stephanie Keating, Director of Athlone Education Centre. Good afternoon, Stephanie.
Good afternoon, David.
Welcome from sunny Athlone. I take the sun is shining down there, and you're going to take us through the Code of Conduct.
Yes, thanks, David, and good afternoon, everybody. Well, what we're looking at here is the updated 2nd edition of the Teaching Council Code of Professional Conduct for Teachers, and this was published in 2016 to reflect the commencement of Part 5 of the Teaching Council Act, the Fitness to Teach piece. And it applies to all teachers registered with the Teaching Council, which effectively is all teachers in state-funded schools. And the code, it professionalises the teaching profession and outlines the ethical values that underpin the standards of teaching, knowledge, skill, competence, and conduct. And while its regulatory function is very important, and we will look at that further in a moment, the code does more than this. It espouses a professional culture, a shared professional discourse, and a way of being. And it's reflected in the daily interactions within the classroom and in the school and among the broader school community. And it would prompt a deep reflection among teachers. I suppose very important is at its very heart are the needs of the learner.
Stephanie, can I ask you a question there? You seem to be saying that this code has elevated the profession. And can you give me examples of where there's a win in this in relation to putting this confidence in teachers and that?
Yes, David, and as you say there, it has elevated the profession. Indeed, it has both elevated and empowered schools. And so one concrete example that comes to mind is the key principles that underpinned the use of the calculated grade system. You know, the teacher's professionalism, the recognition that teachers could be trusted to act with integrity and in a fair and professional way to ensure the best outcome for their Leaving Cert students. That would be one example of the Code of Professional Conduct in action. If we look at the whole process of school self-evaluation, the emphasis now being on schools owning the evaluation process instead of an over-reliance on the external model of evaluation. Similarly, with the DRIHIT process in schools, we have schools now signing off on teachers following the satisfactory completion of the probation process. Again, a task which in the past could only have been undertaken by the inspectorate. The thinking behind the student and parent charter, the recognition of the school voice, the whole area of social media and the appropriate online communication among members of the school community. And indeed, the Teaching Council has issued guidance on this in its suite of documents. These are just some of the ways in which the Code of Conduct is exemplified in teachers' practice. You know, teachers acting as professionals with integrity, or teachers as professionals, I should say, acting with integrity, fairness, transparency, and with a firm commitment to the best outcome for the learner at all times.
So you're very positive about the code, and rightly so. And what about ESCI there in supporting teachers? How can you help?
Yes, and as my colleague David said at the outset, you know, the core business of education centres is very much rooted in supporting the standards that are set out in the Code of Practice of the Code of Conduct, and in particularly those standards that relate to professional practice, professional development, and professional collegiality and collaboration. And ESCI collaborates with a number of partner organisations and support services and stakeholders to facilitate and support and complement the provision of a very broad range of professional learning experiences, both at national and at local level, to improve the standards of teaching and learning in the classroom. And I suppose ESCI and this educationists at large would agree it's not just the content of these courses that is important, but also, as the educationalist and researcher, the eminent Professor John Hattie puts it, teachers working collaboratively in a very deep and reflective way. And this is facilitated through the sustained support by education centres of professional communities of practice, teacher professional networks, through the hosting of discussion forums, support group sessions, and education conferences. And like David said at the outset, I would encourage those listening today to continue to avail of the enormous and broad range of supports that your local education centre and that the ESCI network as a whole can offer you in your role as a teacher.
Stephanie, thanks for that, and you do provide a lot of support to teachers, and that's really welcome, and it's been availed of. But like any regulatory body, there are complaints, and in the legal profession it happens all too frequently, unfortunately, like the medical profession. So can you tell me about the role of the Teaching Council in relation to complaints against teachers?
Yes, David. Well, this is the other side of the coin, so to speak, and every profession, as you have said, has a regulation, and the teaching profession is no exception in this regard, nor would we want it to be. This is about protecting the profession, about having procedures in place to address situations where serious issues relating to teachers may arise. And these processes are not intended to replace school procedures already in place that can address professional conduct and professional competence. And schools are advised to exhaust all other measures first when dealing with complaints before referring to the Teaching Council. And this staged approach to address competence and performance issues has already been covered by Ian and Catherine and indeed Fiona. Interesting to hear Ian saying that it's not something that's hugely utilised by schools, but it is the first port of call. And although it is fair to say that the fitness to teach investigations haven't been hugely utilised, either teachers do need to be aware of its importance and to realise that it carries significant weight. Complaints that will be referred to the Teaching Council tend to focus very much on performance and competency issues, also being medically unfit to teach, or if one was convicted in the state of an offence. So the code does fulfil a very important regulatory role. This is protective and it instills trust in the profession. I suppose when you consider that in the past, a teacher convicted of a crime could have subsequently applied for and secured a permanent teaching position, whereas today the Teaching Council has the opportunity to hold its own investigations and remove teachers from the register. But thankfully, most teachers will never be troubled by these processes, but they do have a legal standing and they're there to protect what is indeed a very honourable profession. I would encourage teachers to read the code at an individual level and also to come together as a staff to discuss it and to reflect how visible it is in practice in the classroom and in the school as a whole.
Stephanie, thanks for condensing such a lot of information into just a couple of minutes there. And I really like the idea of staffs, school staff discussing the contents of the Code of Conduct too. We're now going to move on to the results of the poll, and Sive is in the background there. So we're hoping that she may have the results of that poll that we asked you at the outset. So before we conclude. So the first one there, are you clear about your role as a mandated person? Very encouraging there. We have a 90% yes and 10% no. So that's very encouraging. Well done on that. And the second question there, do you understand your legal duty of care to students? And that seems to break fairly evenly, 45-55. Hopefully after today, you might feel a bit more confident. I think you will. Very good. And Sive is now the next one. Have you read your school's health and safety statement? Very impressive, 63%, and 37% haven't. So that's something that can easily be rectified. And then the final one is, I recall, about the fight on the yard. Do you feel confident about dealing with a fight on the yard? It breaks almost 50-50, 49% say yes and 51% say no. But I think on the basis of some of the answers there that we gave, and I think Ian dealt with that in particular, you might be in a better position when you get to discuss it with your colleagues on that. So Sive, thanks very much for that. Any quick comment from David or Ian or Stephanie on that, on the results there? One of you like to make a comment or?
No, well, I think it's very commendable that such a high percentage of teachers are at home with the child protection. That's, you know, the other results I would have are kind of more in line with what I would have expected. But I think it's great, and I mean genuinely to hear that such a high number feel at home with child protection, because DLPs are hugely dependent on classroom teachers to highlight concerns. I mean, the DLP principle is just dependent on the staff to highlight concerns, and I think that's very important to mention. You know,
that's great. That's very positive. Okay, if I'll move on then, if that's okay. Just to David and Stephanie, you're okay about that? Are you? Yeah. You're in concurrence. I can see David there, right? Okay, Stephanie.
I don't want to spend time on takeaways because I'm conscious of the time here, but just, I mean, really what I just want to emphasize, and indeed what Stephanie has already said as well, from ESCI's point of view, is you know, engagement with school policies, engagement with tricky situations, huge, you know, and that's what's really informing a lot of the rationale for today's webinar. So I would just encourage all principals and all teachers to take every opportunity to do that among yourselves. It's very sort of strengthening idea, you know.
Thank you, Ian. And we're now going to move on to David. You're going to have the task of making the formal sort of closing remarks there. So over to you, David, in sunny Monaghan.
Thanks, David. Yeah, look, it's been a whistle-stop tour, I suppose, and scraping the surface of some of the issues, but I want to pay tribute to our collaborators today in Mason, Hayes and Curran for today's session. I suppose I want to acknowledge the ease at which they presented to us some issues that affect a lot of teachers in our daily roles, our daily tasks. It's very reassuring actually to know that the challenges and pitfalls that we see in our own roles in schools are very much part of the everyday for you guys, and hence why the reliable and valuable advice that I mentioned at the start is so dependable. It gives us great confidence to know that advice and that experience is there, and the benefit of that experience today has been fantastic. I thought the session was very practical, particularly reference to previous cases that you have dealt with, and I think that can be very reassuring to teachers, both indeed with maybe personal experience and also maybe avoiding potential experiences like that in the future. And all that's left me to do then really is to thank our attendees this evening, and I think for their engagement in today's session, but also in the huge numbers with which they've engaged with ESCI and education centres around the country in this last maybe 9 or 10 or 12 months. It has really been phenomenal. I don't think education has ever been more so to the fore in our media as it is at present. But one thing that's not in the media but should be heralded is the level of professional development that is currently ongoing. I think it reflects very, very positively on our current cohort of teachers and on our profession. And the human capital and the moral purpose that underpins teaching and the teaching profession is very much to the fore when teachers voluntarily give up their time out of their free time to engage with professional development. And the sole intention of that engagement is very often to, I suppose, enrich the lives and the learning experiences of their learners. And that's not something we see reported widely, but I think it's incumbent on us today to mention that and laud that and herald that for our teachers. I mentioned at the outset that many teachers have registered with this evening's webinar with, I suppose, a personal experience in mind or something that resonated with them in the title. I hope at this stage that they're now better equipped, more informed, and be feeling a little bit supported with that challenge or with that personal experience. And just to reiterate again what Stephanie, my colleague, mentioned, that if there's any other areas that you feel that we could assist or support in, we'd be delighted to do that. And again, just to finally thank Mason, Hayes and Curran for this, the initial, as I see it, the initial installment of a partnership that can bring great benefit to our teachers throughout the rest of this school year and for many years to come. So Míle buíochas there. I think we can all agree it was an excellent presentation, very informative, very instructive, and of great value. So thank you all. Thank you all for your inputs.
Thanks, David. And on that note, on behalf of our education team, I'd like to concur with your remarks. Thank everybody for registering and attending, in particular to you, David, and to Stephanie for your presentations today, and also to my colleagues, the head of the education team, Ian, and to Catherine and Fiona for their input and for sharing their expertise. Also, I'd like to send on my good wishes from Liam Reardon and Paul Rochford, who can't be with us this evening. But if we can help you in any way with any of these issues, you've got our contact details there. Please feel free to contact us. And we want to wish you well. The primary schools are opening up from junior infants to second class, and at post-primary level are Leaving Cert students and the teachers who are teaching them, along with our special ed people, and of course everybody who's continuing the teaching online. Gurumila Mahagav Agus Lawn.